In this project we're going to look at a technique called double processing. We're going to try and work this file twice, once for the shadows and once for the highlights. One of the reasons we're about to do this is because it's very difficult to achieve a final outcome in Adobe Camera Raw by itself, just processing a single time. For instance, if I bring down the highlights, we're getting a very small amount of detail in that sky, and I know there's a lot more that could be had if we process that maybe with a negative exposure, but then that compromises the deep dark shadows of this cowboy. Okay, so let's just hit the default there to reset all of those sliders. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a tighter crop on this image. So we're going to select the crop tool here and then just come in and click and drag around an area of the image that I want. I'm just going to avoid clipping the top of that horse's ear there, and just to center off, I'm holding down the space bar just as I move that over to the right slightly. And there, that's about a good composition. So I'll just let go, and then I'll hit the zoom or the hand tool to come out of that crop. Okay, my first stage for this is to edit for the shadows. Okay, there's two ways of opening up this dark shadow detail, either with the exposure value here. I can push this up very high. Notice what happens to the highlight detail as we push the exposure slider up. We're going to start losing too much detail in this bright white shirt. Okay, let's just zero that by double clicking and show you if we pull up the shadows instead, we can bring open the darker values but leave the highlight values still with plenty of detail. The best of both worlds, however, is probably going to be a little bit of each. Okay, so I'm going to raise this by about a stop and a half or so, and I'm also going to bring up the shadows perhaps to plus 30. We're losing contrast in the file now, so I'm going to add a lot more contrast back in, maybe up to plus 50 or so, to add a bit of contrast back into this file. You'll notice if we look at the histogram, we've lost that black point through those adjustments, and this file is going to look a lot better if we reconnect the black point. So I'm just going to grab that black slider and drag it down, perhaps to a value of around about minus 50. Should give us a black point with this image. It's probably looking a little bit too saturated now, so I'm just going to drop the vibrance down, maybe minus 10, just to get rid of some of that excess color saturation that we're seeing there. We'll just go over to the Detail tab, and we'll check also noise reduction. Because we've opened up the shadows so significantly, it's important to make sure that the noise that will now be apparent in this image is suppressed or managed. I'll just zoom into actual pixels. We can pick this up from the menu here, or use the keyboard shortcut. On a Mac, that's Command Option 0. On a PC, that would be Control Alt 0, and as you can see, because we've opened up a couple of stops with this image and the ISO was raised to 800 ISO, we're getting a significant amount of noise now. So let's do a little bit of noise reduction here. Okay, I'm going to drag this up to around about 60 or so. Okay, now what we can do is if we use quite generous amounts of noise reduction, we can also steal some of the fine detail, and so often it's best in order to restore some of that detail is also to raise the luminance detail slider. I'm going to drag that up to about 70 to 75 in order to pick up some of that fine detail again. Okay, I'm not going to sharpen this image now. I'm going to sharpen this image perhaps in the main editing space of Photoshop using the Smart Sharpen filter. So I'll just fit on screen again. That's Command 0 in order to fit on screen. Okay, we're pretty much ready now to open this image into the main editing space of Photoshop. Okay, and this will be the first stage of the processing. Okay, so if you don't have this open object button, then just hold down the shift key, which will convert the open image to the open object. I have this set in my workflow options here so that all of my images actually go into the main editing space as smart objects. This always gives me the advantage of being able to come back in and adjust any of these raw settings at a later stage. So I'll simply select OK and then click Open Object. When the image opens up inside of the main editing space of Photoshop, we can see in the Layers panel that instead of having a background layer, we have this Smart Object. And this allows us to double click inside of the Smart Object thumbnail and edit the contents back inside of Adobe Camera Raw. Okay, in order to double process this, I'm going to make a copy of this layer. I'm not going to use the keyboard shortcut Command or Control J or even drag it to the new layer icon. I'm going to right click and access the menu New Smart Object via Copy. Okay, this makes two separate versions of the Adobe Camera Raw file inside of this, and so if we make changes to this top copy, the bottom copy will remain as is, i.e. it won't affect this base layer. Okay, if we were to just use that duplicate Command J or drag it to the new layer icon and then edit the contents of one, the changes will flow through to both versions. Okay, so we're going to double click on this Smart Object thumbnail in order to bring this duplicate into Adobe Camera Raw. Okay, so we have all of the settings that we use to prepare it for the shadows of this image, and I'm just going to hit the default to 0 all of those settings. Okay, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take the exposure slider and bring it back down a full 2 stops in order to get as much detail into that sky as possible. I'm not too worried too much about having a white point at this stage. I'm more interested in getting a good amount of highlight detail. So I might also back that up with some highlight adjustment here. So I'm going to bring the highlights down as well, perhaps down to -30 or 40 in order to bring in just a little bit more detail. We can also add to that detail by coming into the effects panel and also bringing in a highlight priority vignette in order to get a good rich amount of detail going on inside of this image. If you want to build up the contrast a little bit inside of this sky or the highlights here, we could raise that white slider just to increase the localized contrast in there. I'm going to take that up to around about +40 in order to give myself a good contrast range in that sky. Okay, now we're going to open this into the main editing space simply by just clicking on the OK button now, and that will update the preview that we have inside of Photoshop. Now, in order to mask between the best highlight detail on this layer and the best shadow detail on the layer below, we're going to start with a selection. We're just going to choose the quick selection tool, just press W on the keyboard there, and in order to move around now, I've got the auto enhance option switched on, and I'm just going to move around that sky, okay, moving over the top of that cowboy's head, and then moving down onto the right hand side. So I've got a full selection of that sky. I'm now going to come to the base of the layers panel and click on the add layer mask. Now the composite file at the moment is going to look pretty awkward because of that very hard edged transition between the shadows and the highlights. So we're going to set about making a much more gentle transition between the two exposures here. So the layer mask on this layer is the active component still. Okay, and we're going to come up to the filter menu and come down to other and choose minimum. And we're going to choose a value of around about 30. Now in this particular project it doesn't really matter whether we have the preserve squareness or roundness selected. Okay, I'll go for the squareness. It just offsets it perhaps just a little bit more, and we'll select OK to apply that adjustment. So I basically move the edge of that mask back away from the subject. We're going to create the softer transition by coming up to Filter, Blur, and then choosing Gaussian Blur. Okay, and I'm going to choose quite a heavy Gaussian blur here. We're going to go for around about 250 pixels. The precise value isn't absolutely crucial. Okay, so long as it's a reasonably high value to give us that very soft transition between the two exposures, so we can't see where one exposure begins and ends. Okay, and we'll select that. Now what is happening is, if we have a look at the shirt detail here, some of this darker exposure is spilling over into the shoulders here and creating a darker edge here. So we might go and clean up these edges to create a slightly brighter edge. Okay, so we again, with the quick selection tool still selected, we're just going to roll that over both of these shoulders in order to pick up those as selections. And then with the layer mask selected, I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut for filling with the foreground color. Now we want the foreground color to be black in this instance. Okay, so I'm just pressing the D on the keyboard for default colors, and then the X to make the black as the foreground color here. And now I'm going to hold down the Alt key on a PC or the Option key on a Mac, and then press the Delete key on a Mac or the Backspace key on a PC, and that fills that with black as the contents, which cleans up that mask nicely there. Okay, and let's just lose that selection, okay, by coming up to the Select menu and choosing Deselect. Okay, now what we'll often find with those selections using the quick selection or magic wand tool is the edge of this mask is going to be quite harsh. Let's just zoom in a little, and so we can see that harsh edge mask. We can actually soften this mask and create a more gentle transition on that edge, so we alleviate the problems of edge artifacts there by just selecting the blur tool in the tools panel. So I'll just click on the blur tool. I've got the mode set to normal and I'm using a strength of 100%. I'll just reduce the size of that brush using the square bracket keys, and now I'm going to run that blur tool along over that edge just to create a much softer transition there. Okay, with my finger on the space bar, I'm just going to scoot over to the other side and repeat that process on this edge of the mask, just running down over the edge just to make a slightly softer transition there, and Command 0 to fit on screen, or Control 0 on a PC. And we'll click back on the image thumbnail in order to come back to the view of the image rather than of the layer mask there. Okay, if I want to bring the level of the shirt down and put a little bit of detail, we could actually do that in one of two ways. We could go back into the smart object here and perhaps lower the exposure and increase the shadows. Okay, we could just do that by bringing in and raising that shadows like so, bringing a little bit more detail there. Okay, and that would update the changes. Alternatively, we can process directly in the main editing space. Here we could come up to the image menu, adjustments, and pick up the shadow highlights adjustments to control either the shadows or highlights, and this is going to be applied as a smart filter even though it's one of the adjustments. Okay, now this dialog box is open in its expanded state. If this is the first time you're using this dialog, then the chances are it will open up in this collapse state here. Now we're not really interested in modifying the shadows in this instance, we've already done that, so I'm just going to wind those shadows back down to 0, but I am interested in controlling the highlights. I'm going to click on that Show More Options, and we're going to perhaps reduce the tonal width around about 20 to 25 here, so that's just controlling the brightest values here, and then we can drag the amount slider just to push up the right amount of detail into that shirt, and somewhere again around about 20 to 25 should give me the right amount of detail that I'm looking to see inside of that shirt, inside of this image, and then we'll select OK. Now again, we're working with a completely non-destructive workflow here, so at any time I can go back into either of these smart objects and edit the raw information, or I can double click on the smart filter and adjust the settings that we've just applied here. Okay, now if we're noticing that this is a global adjustment on the shadow highlights, and we're affecting perhaps some areas of the hat or the highlights in the eyes that we're not looking to affect, then we can limit this adjustment just by inverting the layer mask. Okay, we can do that in the Properties panel, or we can just use the keyboard shortcut Command I on a Mac or Control I on a PC. We'll invert that mask and fill that with black. Okay, now we can select the brush tool inside of the tools panel. We've got the mode set to normal and the opacity to 100%. I'm going to use a brush which is set to 0% hardness here, and then I'm simply going to paint inside here to reveal the adjustments. I'll use a slightly larger brush, and then we can paint inside of the layer mask. Now I've got black set as the foreground color, so we're not going to go anywhere with that foreground color, so I'll just need to switch. So now I have white as the foreground color, and now I can paint that detail in to the shirt. I'm just holding back away from the shoulders and just painting most of the detail on the interior here. Okay, and that gives me the extra detail I was looking for, and that's not going to impact on any of the other areas of the image. Now we're going to sharpen this image. Again, most of the detail of this image is sitting inside here. We could go back and sharpen inside of Adobe Camera Raw, or we could use one of the sophisticated sharpening filters inside of the main editing space. The only problem with adding this now as a new smart filter is because we've modified the smart filters mask, the sharpening would only take place in the shoulder area here. There is a way around this, is we can create a new clean mask for a new smart object just by converting this smart object into another smart object. We'll just go convert to smart object. This just places this smart object and its smart filter into a new smart object. Okay, we can now come over to the filter menu, come down to sharpen, and choose Smart Sharpen, which is by far and away the most sophisticated of the sharpening tools. Now if your dialog box is not opening up in such an expanded state, just remember we can resize this dialog box so we get maximum amount of feedback about what is going on. Okay, I'm just going to take this reduce noise slider down, and as you can see is because this image started with a high ISO, as we start to sharpen high ISO images we are going to bring back some of that noise. So we have a nice new feature inside of this Smart Sharpen which allows us to suppress that detail. Just raising it to 30 will suffice to push that excessive noise down, and that gives me the freedom to choose an appropriate radius. Here I'm choosing a fairly high amount, just over 200, but keeping the radius fairly small here, down to a 0.7 pixels, and we'll apply that as a global smart filter. Okay, now if we want to mask this just to certain areas of the image, again we could just click on that smart filter mask, use the keyboard shortcut Command I on a Mac or Control I on a PC to fill that, and now we can paint with white just in the areas that we actually want to sharpen. I'll just zoom in a couple of times and reduce the size of that brush, and I'll just wipe over a couple of the areas where I'm looking for maximum sharpness, perhaps in the detail in the eyes and the mouth there, and leave the rest of the image in its unsharpened state. Command 0 again to fit on screen. If I ever need to come back in and modify the first smart filter that we applied, which was the shadow highlights for the shirt, then all we need to do is double click this smart object. Okay, click OK, and this opens the smart object that's embedded in that layer, and this now gives us access both to the smart filter and also the raw file inside of this smart object here. If we haven't made any changes, we can just press Command W or Control W to close. If we do make some changes, then we'll just save those changes using Command S for save or Control S on a PC. I'll just close this file and then come back to the master multi-layered file. And this really completes this workflow. Okay, we've done half of the work inside of Adobe Camera Raw and the other half of the work in the main editing space of Photoshop. And again, we've used a completely non-destructive workflow which gives us maximum flexibility for editing any aspect of this workflow.